Hello there, and welcome to the Thinky Fellows podcast, part of the 1517 podcast network of shows. You can go to 1517.org/podcasts to see all of our shows there. My name is Caleb Keith, and today I am joined by Dr. Adam Francisco.
Just Adam Francisco, because your dad's somewhere in a car.
Isn't he always somewhere in a car? Almost as much as I am. No.
Or truck. He'd probably want us to say truck, because that's he's probably driving a truck, right? A diesel truck?
He is in his truck this time, although he had not been driving it very often for a little bit, gas prices and all. So,
yeah, diesel especially is sky high out there, I understand.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. It was funny. We went on we did this, Eric and I and the kids did a road trip where I went and set up podcasting equipment for our new show, Preaching the Text, which you can subscribe to on Apple Podcasts and such like that. But when I was driving up there, we got into Nevada and Oregon, and when I was in Nevada, diesel was 10 cents cheaper a gallon than gas, which I hadn't seen in a long time.
Yeah, interesting. I remember the days when I bought my truck, or I was thinking about buying this truck that I have, and, I don't know if Scott's ever kidded me on the show about being cheap, but I'm cheap, and he was pushing and even making fun of me for not wanting to get a diesel truck. And I remember one of my arguments was, I don't know how this is going to go here in California. At that time we were living there, and I was expecting to live there and die there. But and now I think I should bring it up to him. I'm glad I got a.
Yeah, you should be like, how's that extra $1 a gallon? No, that's it's definitely a thing. That's for sure. Well, the Think Fellows is going to go off on I want to call it a mini series, right? We do all these series throughout the years, but it feels weird to call something a series that isn't going to be 6 months long. Maybe that's just in my head.
Well, I suspect once we tell them what it's going to be, or we haven't told them yet, but it's going to be kind of lengthy, because I don't know that. I mean, I'm just thinking about how we're going to do this because of the details. Can I say what we're going to do? We're going to take an excursion, maybe even go on a little adventure, well, a big adventure with Tolkien, and we'll start with Hobbit and go through the Lord of the Rings. And I think that's it, right? We're not going to go into his works that were published after his death, and
no, maybe briefly comment on them, but I don't think whole episodes for it, unless maybe we all become Tolkien fanatics by the end of this.
Well, I'm increasingly becoming one. If you put Lewis and Tolkien up against each other, of course everybody loves Lewis. Well, how can you not love Lewis, right? But the more you read of Tolkien and read about him, at least for me, makes me want to know the details, the insider details, the scholarly conversation about all this stuff. So I suspect this is going to be a wild ride, and I bet we will become at least Tolkien wonks by the end of it. Hopefully our listeners will too.
Yeah, I hope so. I had a lot of interest in Tolkien younger in life. Not that I'm crazy old, but just in high school, late end of middle school, early high school, I really wanted to conquer these giant books. Right? It was sort of like if you can really read, you can finish The Lord of the Rings. You can finish this 3-volume fiction, and so I really loved it then and read them. But it's been so long, and then sort of the franchising entertainment aspect of Tolkien, takes over. You watch the movies, which are great, and the details start to fade away for sort of just fun mythical land. And when you revisit, what you see is that even before we start reading the fiction, is just that he really was a detail-oriented guy, and that his life is very interesting as well in terms of that. I think one of the notable differences between he and Lewis, it is, there's some doctrine differences for sure. We'll be able to get into that at some point. But he lived an extremely different life. I mean, we often compare them because of things like service in World War II and the professorships.
Yeah, World War One.
I'm sorry,
right? Yeah,
World War One.
Just because I know you'll probably get emails if.
Oh no! Oh no! The whippersnapper messed it up. Oh no! Yes, no. World War One. That is correct. And service in the World War One, and their professorships. So there's some comparisons there. But Tolkien's life was one of a family man in a very different way than Lewis's. One wife from a very young age. Many children, and the fictional work that he writes is not just a exercise in making what he academically studied come to life and world building, but seems to really start with the pursuit of telling his children good stories, and sort of grows from there. That's just not the same story for Lewis, right? Lewis doesn't start in Narnia. We've talked about that. There's a niece and some other children in his life, but it's not this sort of bedtime storytelling endeavor that grows into a writing project like it is for Tolkien, where it stems from his family, and I would guess then the myth that he wants to leave with his children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that comparison ends up being different. I think one of the other things, and maybe I think some of the conversations you and I have had off the air lends this direction as well. I find him interesting because the number one flaw with studying Lewis or talking about Lewis is that because he was, I think, very rightfully sort of evangelical in his approach to theology, theology for the masses, apologetics, directed at the unbeliever, a fiction which is very Christocentric and obvious about that as well. It's not hidden, and sort of preaches death and resurrection. Lewis becomes this object where when you're reading him, if you're a Lutheran, you can find all the Lutheran adjacent things in Lewis, and Lewis is a Lutheran. Or if you're a Calvinist, you can find all the the Reformed adjacent things in Lewis, and he's a Calvinist. Or if you're an American evangelical, you can find all these sort of evangelical public profession of faith elements in Lewis, and he's an evangelical, right? And so he's very malleable for that reason, especially to us Protestants.
Like a good Anglican, right? It's you can find what you want in Anglicanism. That's its strength and also its weakness. It's very broad. There was a joke that they would tell at Oxford where you'd walk on I forget the name of the road, but it was like it was at the Bodleian Library at the Radcliffe Camera in particular. And as you walk, I guess it was south. You'd go from what was it? Broad Street to High Street, and they'd say, and as you're walking there, you pass along, there's a college named Jesus College, and they'd say, oh, it's like the Anglican Church. You walk, it's broad, and it goes from broad to high, and you bypass Jesus all along the way, like meaning you miss him, because anyway, silly little joke, but
no, it's good. But the reason that Tolkien's interesting is almost for the opposite. I, as a Lutheran, reading some Tolkien and reading a very good book sent to us by Lexham called Tolkien Dogmatics, which I think we're hoping to do a later episode on after we finish this fiction stuff. He's a honest Roman Catholic. I'm not going to be able to sit here and make Tolkien a Lutheran while we do this. It's just not going to be possible. And if it sounds like I am, let the listener know that some funny business is going on, because he just wasn't. And he wasn't an American evangelical, and he wasn't classically reformed or something like this. He was just sort of an honest Roman Catholic layperson.
Yeah. And in his biography, I don't know all the particular details, but I seem to recall when he moves from, he goes to England on vacation or holiday from South Africa, right? And his dad dies while they're away, and his mom, somewhere in that time frame, converts to Catholicism. I guess she came from a pretty austere Baptist family, if I'm not mistaken. But when she converts. And as she's dying, she had type 1 diabetes, and there was no insulin at that time. She dies pretty early on, and she gave custody of the kids to a Catholic priest, Father Francis, was it? And with the instruction that they be raised as good, maybe even staunch Catholics. And so, he was groomed in that world, and I seem to recall that there were when he realized, he and Edith, before they're married, long before they're married, realized that they loved each other and that they wanted to be married. There was that priest was, I guess, agitated is the word, because she was Protestant, right? But then one of the conditions of them getting married was that she become Catholic, and that was Tolkien, or Ronald, as I guess she probably would have called him. His requirement, that is, if they were to get married, she would have to be Catholic. So reading that biography kind of reminds me of is analogous to a lot of Catholic friends that I know, and how, when they marry somebody who's Protestant, the Protestant has to become Catholic. And it's kind of, if you know good, faithful, traditional Catholics, Tolkien's easy to understand. Or not, I shouldn't say easy to understand, but you can kind of get him, He comes from a culture that's been around for a long time, and probably will stick around for some time, that traditional Catholic ethos.
It helped, just seeing that again, or maybe seeing that clearly for the first time, actually, and not just putting Tolkien in the generic Christian author bucket, helped me realize, because if you're into sort of the fantasy genre, no matter what it is, whether it's you like reading fantasy, you like movies and TV shows that are set in fantasy, you like video games that are fantasy video games, etc., whatever. Much of the lore from that, character building, stems from Tolkien. He's often considered the modern father of fantasy. He retrieves it from the past, so you can't say he invents elves, etc. But what he does do is he retrieves elves and recreates them and reintroduces them in a way that is now the standard way, say, to use elves, dwarves, these medieval men, the limited technology and warfare in your thing, etc. Places, names. And so the thing that happens with that, though, is that genre is very sort of today, I would say, aggressively agnostic or sort of godless, and yet it has this staunch Roman Catholic as its father, and you always have to, you kind of scratch your head when you look at this and you go, how is this a debated thing, as whether the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, etc., are Christian works? And then I'm reminded, as I'm reading, as I'm reminded of a Roman Catholic sort of views of something we've talked about before, theology of imagination or theology of nature, etc., that something, and this is again a difference between, can be Christian. You can have a Christian world or a pre-Christian world, a world with divine elements in it, without being sort of directly revelatory. That nature does more heavy lifting in Catholic theology as far as revealing grace, revealing the goodness of God, than it does for Lutherans like us, and for generically Protestant evangelical Christians in general, who are trying not to leave those things to the imagination, but to specific proclamation of Christ. And so you can just see where Tolkien is doing something where he's infusing a world with grace and gracious, in brackets, sort of elements in it, a world which has all the signs of being designed by a good God, by the good God, without having Christ in the story, like Lewis does with Aslan, or without having a segment of, say, poetry in it, because he puts lots of poetry in the work, which talks about the one true triune God who, sits above all things, etc.
Yeah, I think that really hits the nail on the head on what's distinct about Tolkien. In a way, living in modernity, I should probably say that a little more snobbishly, modernity. He's trying, it's almost like he writes this, at least in part, envisions this whole new, different or analogous world in a way to enchant the world again. Because, Catholics, pre-modern people saw the world as teeming with, I don't want to say deity or divinity, but teeming with supernaturalness. Where God was active all the time, whereas modernity, post sort of Enlightenment and so on, reduces that until we get to this sort of non-theistic kind of, the predomination of non-theistic worldviews. You mentioned these modern fantasy authors. I think the name is Philip Pullman, who's probably one of the leading. He was an Englishman. I forget the name of the series that he wrote, but if I remember correctly, he purposely writes to, or he's overt about challenging the Christian.
Yeah, so his Pullman is sort of, if you're a Christian who likes children's or fantasy literature and wants your kids to read it, Pullman is one of these nemesis, right?
Yeah, he's like the Richard Dawkins,
because he wrote a series called His Dark Materials. I think the famous book that people would recognize from it, and it's the first book in the series, is The Golden Compass. Lots of people read The Golden Compass, and I believe a movie adaptation was made with Daniel Craig as like the lead, right? James Bond is the lead in The Golden Compass. But The Golden Compass is written in order to literally remove God, kill God, is how it's ultimately put in the series. And so, yeah, it's like the opposite of these. I would actually call Pullman in like the opposite of Lewis. So if Lewis is putting Christ and crucifying and raising Christ in a novel, Pullman is trying to do the sort of the work of putting God to death in a novel and leaving him dead, which is just so very interesting. My thesis supervisor for my MA, Allison Milbank, actually has a great article in a book. I guess it's an essay in a book, if you put it that way. Sort of just taking Pullman down, just pointing out how, in order to go on an exercise of anti-religious literature, he has to constantly refer to the religious, the mythical, the mystic, the divine, and that you can't write a book that's intentionally atheistic where the goal is to kill God, because it means that God's there in the first place, and all you're really admitting is that you're angry at him. Yeah.
You're working from borrowed capital.
Yeah,
sort of that
exactly.
presuppositionalist argument.
And she puts it much better than I did, but it is a very good essay on where it's sort of, and she mentions Lewis and Tolkien in there too, as sort of, as you do here, as opposites. I think the other thing would be like, we did some episodes where we talked about Game of Thrones as a project that that doesn't do this as well, and where Martin has great respect for Tolkien, but sort of leaves out the Catholic part of that corpus entirely. And many others have gone on projects as well, where it's like you can just take Tolkien and leave the Catholicism. You can take, especially if what you're interested is the high fantasy fiction. That, to me, not to start our first episode like this, but to me, that actually, as somebody who would say you can't leave God sort of revealed only in the imagination or in nature or etc., that literally it leaves too much to personal interpretation. It doesn't actually leave all readers with divine grace. To me, that's sort of Tolkien's legacy and interpretive legacy, especially, is evident that what you really can do when you sort of leave grace to nature is you'll have a subset of people who just say it wasn't there to begin with in your interpreters. Anybody who is doing that with Lewis would, for instance, be a immediate phony. Like you would know that nothing about what they're doing is legitimate. With Tolkien, this becomes a very honest debate. Is the Lord of the Rings have Christian elements in it, or are Christians reading Christian elements into it?
So that's really interesting, and I wonder, you did an MA on this sort of subject. Does that make the difference in terms of the reception of and the popularity of Lewis versus Tolkien?
That's such a good question. I mean, like I could speculate that could be why Tolkien's in the modern world, right? Tolkien's world is more successful. It's one of the most financially advantageous franchises that's ever existed. It makes countless amounts of money that his family doesn't see most of, which is funny. And I would love to be able to speculate and say that the reason is because you can expand on it, you can play with it, and you don't have to do anything Christian with it while you're doing that. And to be honest, it's not really that dishonest when you do that, right? You don't have to erase paragraphs, pages, or chapters to do that. You just have to underplay sort of divine infusion into a world. And by divine infusion, we mean, like with Tolkien, the universal morals of God, right? Well, we've pointed out many times that, universal morals, natural law, is shared, is not just a Christian thing, but is shared with Greek philosophers, with the Arab world, is shared with the East in some cases, right? If interpreting correctly, like it's sort of universally shared. It's shared with atheistic philosophers who do ethics in many cases. Now, with maybe alterations here and there, and maybe segments pulled out and saying, no, this isn't obvious in the natural world, and we might disagree about what natural law is or isn't. But you can do that if you do not specifically say this is God, this is His Son, or etc. This is His work, this is His law, and these laws are just sort of part of a divinely infused world. It might enchant that world and might it light the imagination on fire, but in this very sort of, it doesn't deliver God to you.
The specifics, yeah.
And so it, and again, it makes it so that, like, if you're a Christian Tolkien fan and you see something inspired by Tolkien that uses, say, like his lore of elves, like Tolkien's version of elves may show up in this video game or something, or like Skyrim is amazing popular franchise, right? Tolkien's version of elves and dwarves may show up in something like Skyrim, and just because Skyrim isn't Christian, you can't be like, well, that's not a good interpretation of elves and dwarves. It's like, no, those look like Tolkien's elves. They have, they're the higher class. They speak in a more poetic form. They live forever. Those are Tolkien's elves. And these dwarves are sort of under the mountain, and they're smiths, and they work hard lives, and they resent the elves because they don't live forever. And you're like, yeah, those are Tolkien's dwarves. And nothing about what I just said has anything to do with Christianity, ethics, morals, or whatever. And so it can still be very honest without touching any of that other project that Tolkien was up to.
That's interesting. My kids play my 10-year-old plays Skyrim. I had no idea. I don't really pay attention to it, so I'll have to go and watch them play. And
that would be a famous one, sort of, where those elements come in. And it's funny, it's not good or bad for leaving the Christian Tolkien behind, because he he created elements and peoples and races and classes and stuff that can be sort of pick up, borrowed, and adjusted without any of that. And it's not like, hey, you need to knock that off. You're misappropriately using Tolkien. No.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. The whole thing with, with Tolkien, because he's a good Catholic, he has a pretty high view of what we might call natural law and the universal values and so on, which we all do, but he's even more so, right? You even see this in one of the biographies or biographical accounts of Tolkien I read recently, talked quite a bit about him picking up this universal language called Esperanto when he was young. I think he was not even in his teens. He learned Esperanto. There's still about 100,000 people who speak Esperanto in the world, I found out. And it was like this late 1880s, I think it was a Polish guy, wanted to develop a language that would be easy to learn by all people of the world, so they could all speak a common language, and it would work to unite the world in sort of global peace and harmony and so on and so forth. And that's not necessarily a Catholic theme in particular, but it is a kind of the whole point about being Catholic is this is universally shared. And because of that, if you look at the Catholic Church and the way it manifests itself across the world, it's very different from South America to Europe to North America and elsewhere. But it is all part of this one thing. But things get really ambiguous, and so its local interpretation is just as good as any other, or one interpretation is just as good as any other, and maybe that is that is what you get in Tolkien and his interpreters. If you read scholarly literature on Tolkien, it's like, this is controversial. Some say this, some say that, because it's so not particular. There's not a whole lot of particular revelation emphasized or special revelation emphasized.
And to defend Tolkien a little bit, like I said, there can be honest debate about, what did Tolkien mean, or can you use Tolkien without the Catholicity, etc. You can, and it can be not dishonest per se. But I think when it comes to interpreting him and asking the question, was this really Catholic? Was this theme really Christian? Is this moral good or this graceful poetry, or etc. really Christian? I think that is when this really starts becoming dishonest, because it would mean that Tolkien, and I don't think, and I've read some of the biographical material or some other stuff, I don't think Tolkien ever said, for this project, I'm setting aside my Catholic faith. And if you look at the man,
he couldn't do that.
He was, staunch Catholic. He was faithfully Catholic, would be another, positive way of saying that. He was faithfully Catholic. His whole worldview, his world, the way he approached not just showing up to church. Some of us believe we can separate who we are at church from who we are on the day-to-day. Someone like Tolkien was not doing that. There's no evidence to believe that. And so there is a level of dishonesty when you completely erase it. I don't think it's dishonest when you say, I'm using these fantasy elements without Catholicity in my own works or in these other things. That's one thing. But then to reinterpret and say, well, Tolkien didn't use the Catholic faith either to make this in the first place, that's where the dishonesty begins. And you actually do see that still as well. And so I do think it is, we have to be, even with Tolkien, who wasn't being as explicit or revealing Christ in the explicit or God in the explicit in these ways, I don't think we should just surrender him to a agnostic or atheistic interpretation of his works either, because he would not have said, my faith, I set my faith to the side when I was writing these. That's just silly.
I wonder, do you happen to know what Tolkien, he lived about 10 years after Vatican II. He died in 73. I wonder what he thought of Vatican II.
I haven't read anything on that.
A very modern.
We should. I haven't gotten far enough in this Tolkien dogmatics book to see if that is revealed in there.
Yeah. I'll make that my little special project for this to see. I suspect, being a faithful and very traditional and loyal Catholic, he didn't criticize it, but I bet he had some misgivings, assuming he was keeping up to date with what was going on in this early '60s. Yeah, I'll check into that, because that's the age of where this might. I hope this isn't taken as a cheap shot, but that's the liberalization of Catholicism, that really entrenches or emboldens the liberalism that you find in some Catholics at Vatican.
Yeah,
II.
and I think what we do know about his theology is that he was
liberal.
no liberal, both theologically and sort of politically, and in his life values as well. In all of those realms, he was definitely not. Probably what we would say even more politically or socially conservative than Lewis by
absolutely
actually significant amount. I mean, we have some letters that he didn't send to Lewis, and we do know of some real communication he had with Lewis, really, really objecting to what we would call air quotes, everybody, lifestyle decisions that Lewis was making about. So,
Alistair McGrath's biography of Lewis spends quite a bit of time, thankfully, talking about Lewis's relationship with his friends, Tolkien and others. And you get a sense that, and this is not a judgment, but Lewis's life is kind of a mess. And Tolkien's life seems more ordered.
Tolkien's life, just from as an outside observer, is just I'm not trying to be rude, but is a little more honorable and respectable in this traditional sense.
Yeah, I find it much more admirable than Lewis's life. Without,
if I was I want you to emulate one of these people. If I looked at somebody and was like, this is the person whose life example is better, it's Tolkien's.
Yeah. They had 4 children, right? 3 or 4 children, married for I don't know how many decades, and just seemed very stable. And he just slowly, quietly, humbly is the right word, becomes both a tutor at a college. He's at a couple colleges. I think Merton was the last one, and also a professor, a chair at the University of Oxford. And that's at the University of Oxford back in those days, and even still to this day, being a doctor is nothing. If you're called professor, that's something. That means you're on the university faculty, not just the faculty of the college. And I remember Lewis was always trying to get that, and it doesn't happen until very late in life. For Tolkien, it happens not because he did anything fancy, just because he just grinded it out. He's grinding out his academic work, teaching, and so on. And then I'm trying to think, with Tolkien, it's almost like he just lives this quiet, professional or vocational life. He does what his vocation requires of him, doing good academic work and teaching well. Although I read that Lewis was the rock star when it came to teaching, and Tolkien was kind of boring.
Yeah,
he was the guy who read essays. And
I read one where there was some unfortunate circumstance in which they were lecturing at the same time. And unlike American universities where we're attendance, and you're in Tolkien's class, you're going to this lecture, you could sort of float around to lectures you want to do. And it's 3 people at Tolkien's lecture, and Lewis is pouring out into the streets. And you're and I think there was something about Tolkien just sort of knowing that he was a dry lecturer as well. It wasn't no surprise that people would rather hear Lewis talk than him.
Yeah.
And I think so too. He's the thing I love the most about reading and seeing Tolkien's life. In this first, I realized this. I was in New York for the Mockingbird Conference, and while I was there happened to be the upper section of the Morgan Museum was a temporary Tolkien exhibit. And so I had the luck of accidentally being in New York City for something else while this was there. And I had a free day before I flew home after Mockingbird. And I walked to the Morgan and got to go see this exhibit. And they had some great information there. And the one that was apparent to me, and whoever laid out this exhibit, I'm glad they focused on this, was just how much of his life he was about being a good father to his kids, or his concern. Much of his concern was about his children. Yeah. And so that is like extremely insightful to me. I found out about these Father Christmas letters that I hadn't heard about before that were written to his kids, and the origins of the Hobbit being bedtime stories to his children, and all sorts of things where that is a very admirable thing. And he also was able to, like you said, have this honored position at Oxford as a called professor, and balance hanging out with the boys and grabbing a beer, and just he sort of nailed it in that respect.
What would be interesting is not that I'm not a big fan of this, but what do they call it? Psychohistory or psychobiography, like of the Erik Erikson sort. It'd be interesting to know if, I'll have to do some poking around, if somebody's done that with Tolkien or Lewis, and because they have, both of them serve in the war. It'd be interesting to see what the take of a psychologist or a modern psychologist would be on these two characters. And one more thing I want to add, though, just lest you think you're special by seeing that traveling Tolkien exhibit. I live less than a mile away from the desk that Tolkien wrote The Hobbit on. So yeah, at the Marion E. Wade Center here in Wheaton. So just saying, I'm a little more special.
Congratulations. Yeah, that's good. So that's, I think, our roadmap. As Adam said, I was going to point this out. I found this out last night because I was trying to figure out when was the last time we did Tolkien specifically, because we've done some episodes on Tolkien before. And it was exactly 1 year ago from this episode.
Really? It's been that long? I thought it was sooner, because I was thinking, should we really be doing this? Because we did a little bit of this, but...
No, we did an episode titled J.R.R. Tolkien on December 7th, 2021. And this episode is going up on December 6th, 2022. Nice. So that is pretty cool. Basically exactly 1 year from that.
It's almost like it's faded.
Yeah. And then the idea here is we will do The Hobbit. That will be, the plan is for that to be next episode. That is the easiest one in front of us. The easiest episode in front of us.
A mere 300 pages or whatever it is, and then we get to the Gigantors.
Then we get to the real stuff. And I do want to say, then I believe we're going to do a Christmas episode that I don't know how related it will be, but I know we're going to do at least a Christmas episode of Thinking Fellows, and then we will pick up with Lord of the Rings. Exactly how many episodes we use to break that down, I don't know, but I think at least 3. But we will have internal discussions about how we do that. So please do look forward to joining us as we read The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Maybe you can read that with us. If you're listening to this, you have a week to read The Hobbit, which may be really quickly. So there are some very good audiobook versions of these that are like Andy Serkis, who is Gollum and does a lot of the motion capture thing. Well, not in his Gollum voice, but he does have narrations of these books, so which are very good. I've listened to those before. 2 years ago, I started reading The Hobbit with my kids at night, and then didn't finish it. So just got to pick that back up, and we'll get through it. Cool. Any other closing comments, Adam?
I don't think so. I'm looking forward to it, though I'm not looking forward to all the reading. But I was trying to think back to when I first read The Hobbit a couple hours ago, and this distinct image came in my head. It was in high school. Like, I think that's when you said you first read it. And I remember I could not listen to music while I was reading. I typically did that when I was younger, especially when it came to homework. I always had punk rock blaring. I had one of these old school, you probably don't even know these things, but like this 3-tiered stereo that I had bought at a Goodwill or something, and it had a record, a turntable on it, and I had all these little 7-inch punk rock records, and I remember having to turn off. It was I had to be disciplined about it. I had to turn off the the music to read through The Hobbit. I must have been 14 or 15 or something like that. But I'm trying to remember how I got the book, whether my parents gave it to me or my dad had it on the shelf. And but I remember loving it. And then I read it again I think maybe 15 years ago when I was living in England, and looking forward to talking about it, I guess, next week already. Yeah, next Monday we'll record something.
Next Monday we will record something. So we'll see what that something is. But, well, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Thinking Fellows podcast. If you're a new listener, I would, and you want to keep up with this series, the best way to do that is to subscribe in your favorite podcasting app. The Thinking Fellows is free to follow and subscribe in things like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Podcast Addict, and a whole lot more. We will be doing this for the next at least a month or so, and then we'll be moving on after that, and hopefully whatever we do after that will remain interesting to you. So if you'd like to support the show, go to 1517.org and 1517.org/donate, and we will catch you next time. Bye.